Instead of putting a cracker under a politician, why not some TNT? Today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. Now, my next guest on today is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, and he is a leading British historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia and former Soviet Union. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Law and Modern History at London Guildhall University, received a master's degree in Modern History at Royal Holloway, University of London, and also at Royal Holloway, he was awarded a PhD in Russian history. You can find him on X at Dr. Marcus P. Mr. Papadopoulos, how are you today?
I'm very well, and thank you ever so much for having me on your show.
It is all my pleasure, sir. I love a bit of history. That's kind of what I do in my own journalism, is I go diving through the history and I look for the reoccurring themes that we see happening around today. And there is a lot of that, of course. And so that goes on to my first question for you, which is, as Russia invaded Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, the Western rhetoric became indistinguishable from that of 1950s. Are we doomed to repeat the past because we don't learn from history?
Regrettably, we see in the Western world, such as in Britain and in America, scant regard for history. And I believe that is by design, because if people do not know the past, how can they understand the present? How can they try to plan for the future? Also, a people who is ignorant about their history is a people who can be easily deceived and easily exploited by their ruling elite. In regard to the war in Ukraine, this is a war which could have been avoided. The country which we know as Ukraine, ever since it became independent in December of 1991, has been projected by Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists as distinct from Russia, distinct in cultural and religious terms. Now, that is a falsehood, and a grotesque falsehood. In the March 1991 referendum, which was held in the Soviet Union, in which the Soviet people were asked, do you wish to preserve the USSR? 76% of the Soviet people voted in the affirmative to preserve the Soviet Union. In the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, over 70% of the population voted to stay within the USSR. So the notion that Ukraine is distinct from Russia, that Ukraine was a prisoner in the Soviet Union, is absolutely a lie. Why is that important? It is important because when the Russians say that Ukraine is not just imperative to them when it comes to national security, but it is also imperative to the Russian national identity, that is absolutely correct. That is not Russian propaganda. That is not being a Putin apologist. That is a historical truth. Kiev, not Kiev, Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. If you go to the National Archives in Kew and go back over hundreds of years, you will not read one British diplomat, for example, referring to Kiev as Kiev. So that is partly the reason as to why the war in Ukraine could have been avoided. If the Western ruling elites had accepted that Ukraine is central to the Russian national identity, then this war could have been avoided. But alas, history was totally discarded by the Western ruling elites. And of course, they're useful idiots in politics and in the media know nothing about history. When they write opinion pieces, for example, in the Telegraph or in the Guardian or in the Times, they do not know what they are talking about. They have no integrity. They have no reputation to guard. They write what they write because they are paid, and they are paid exceedingly well. So again, history is absolutely imperative. Russia is not an angel. There is no country in the world which is an angel, but by God, the Americans and the British are anything but angels. And yet, here's the inversion. They project themselves as being angels. They project themselves as whiter than white. At least the Russians don't do that.
I love the cut of your jib, as they say, Dr. Papadopoulos. I believe that a lot of people who I spoke to who say in the 90s, Ukrainians and Russians saw themselves as cousins. And before that, they saw themselves as indistinguishable from each other. They was the same sort of people who had the same history, had a shared history in many ways. And of course, the Western powers have tried very hard using NGO after NGO. I mean, I've reported on the fact that when things like the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia happened, they used 50 to 150 NGOs to spur on that revolution. By the time it got to 2004 in Ukraine, it was 30,000 NGOs, Western NGOs in that country alone. So the importance of it is obviously seen by the West, and is obviously understood by the West. Is this the reason why Ukraine is now central? Because Ukraine is so massively important to Russian history?
Allow me to say something very quickly. The only part of Ukraine where you will find intense anti-Russian sentiment is in the westernmost part of the country. The regions being Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, Volyn, and Rivne. It is absolutely correct that there, the vast majority of the population is bitterly hostile to Russia. Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, modern-day Russia. Why? Because the aforementioned regions were for hundreds of years controlled by the Poles, the Lithuanians, then the Austrians, and then the Poles again. There is a lot of Polish, Lithuanian, and Austrian blood in the aforesaid regions, and that is why a lot of the people in those regions are Catholic as opposed to Orthodox. So that is something that we must take into serious consideration. Regarding the rest of Ukraine, well, again, it is not Russian propaganda to say this. We have Ukraine today as a country because of internal borders, map making, which was carried out by Lenin, no different to the map making carried out by Tito in Yugoslavia. Now, Lenin created the borders within the Soviet Union, which were 100% artificial, partly for administrative reasons, partly for ideological reasons. Interestingly enough, Stalin actually opposed the name USSR. He opposed these internal borders. He wanted Soviet Russia to be called the Russian Federation, but Lenin was the leader, and therefore Stalin had to accept the wishes of Lenin. But those internal borders really had no meaning in practice when the Soviet Union was alive. However, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, not collapsed, the Soviet Union did not collapse. The Soviet Union was dissolved by three treacherous Soviet politicians, Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich. They went against the will of the Soviet people. So the Soviet Union was dissolved. But once the Soviet Union was no more, those internal borders became national borders. And from 1992 onwards, the West saw an opportunity to ensure that Russia would never rise again. Russia would never have the influence and power which it wielded in the Soviet period. So they looked at Ukraine to encircle Russia. Of course, along with other countries in Eastern Europe, the dream of the Americans, for example, was to see NATO member states from the Baltic states all the way down to the Black Sea, including Ukraine, because such a cordon sanitaire would result in Russia being encircled in Europe, which would mean a weakened Russia in Europe and thereby a weakened Russia in the world. Even though Russia in the 1990s was on its hands and knees politically, economically, in terms of society and militarily, still the West thought that the day could come when Russia resurrects its fallen superpower status. So that is why Ukraine is absolutely central. Also, if Ukraine was to be a member of NATO, which will never happen, because Ukraine, the day will come when Ukraine ceases to exist. But if Ukraine, hypothetically speaking, was to be a member of NATO, then Russian national security would be in serious danger. The Russian strategic nuclear deterrent would be jeopardized by the Americans, and also NATO tactical aircraft operating from, say, Kiev or from Kharkov could reach Moscow in between 12 and 15 minutes. So that is why Russia will never countenance Ukraine being in NATO. That is why the Russians entered Ukraine and began their military campaign. And I have said from day one of the Russian military campaign that the Russian army will capture either all or most of Ukraine. The minimum the Russians will take will go from the Donbass, cross the south, and up to and including the regions of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which, if you are looking at a map of Ukraine, are to the west of Kiev. I often ponder whether the Russians will go into the westernmost part of Ukraine. There could be good defense reasons for them going there, but on the other hand, they would bring in populations. They would bring populations into the Russian Federation which are very hostile to everything to do with being Russian. That is one mistake Stalin made when he brought those regions into the Soviet Union. Yes, Stalin added defense to Soviet defenses by having those regions live off Ternopil in the Soviet Union. But in the long term, he brought a population into the country which was vehemently anti-Soviet, anti-Russian.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really love your rundown. We're going to go to a quick break for the news. Come back. I'll have a question from the chat for you as well. You're listening to today's News Talk TNT.
Want to be a part of the conversation? Then let us know on the TNT Radio Interactive Live Chat Room, lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. Now, I'm here with Dr. Papadopoulos. I'm really enjoying listening to you. So you're going to have to come on the show again because your knowledge is obviously second to none, and I really like a bit of that. I always love a little bit of knowledge. So question from the chat. Joel Allen has asked, was Putin's dialect about Russian history in his interview with Tucker Carlson correct or accurate?
Yes, indeed, it was correct. I listened to the entire interview between Carlson and Putin, and in particular, I paid attention to the first part in which Putin gave a rundown of Russian history, including Ukraine. And yes, it was absolutely sound. I remember a few years ago, I took part in a live television debate in which there were a couple of American scholars who were opposing what I was saying about Ukraine. And I said to them, okay, let me test your competence to talk on matters relating to Ukraine. Tell me the significance of the year 1654, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I said to them, That is, those are fundamental events in Russian history and Ukrainian history. The presenter of the television show asked them to answer Dr. Marcus's question. They didn't have a clue. They just brushed it off. They referred to me as a Russian propagandist. And one of them indeed said, and I quote, "Why should I care about a 300-year-old dusty treaty?" Well, let me tell you and your audience this. In 1654, there was a region called the Ukraine, meaning the borderland. And it was a very small region centered around Zaporozhye. And it was inhabited by East Slavs who were members of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Zaporozhian Cossacks. They were threatened by the Poles. In 1654, they asked Tsar Alexei of the Tsardom of Russia, it wasn't called the Russian Empire then, it was called the Tsardom of Russia, for the Tsar to incorporate their land, the borderland, into the Tsardom of Russia so that they would be protected against the Poles. So the Tsar accepted that. That was in 1654. The Treaty of Pereyaslav was signed between the Tsar Alexei of Russia, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the leader of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. From that point onwards, the Russian Empire began to expand. And when it began to expand, it took in new regions. And the Tsars simply added those new regions to an already existing region called the Ukraine, the borderland. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin did the same. He incorporated regions such as the Donbass into what was called the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So there, prior to 1991, there had never been a country called Ukraine. And again, if you go to the National Archives in Kew, look in the 19th century, look in the 18th century, no British diplomat is referring to a race called the Ukrainians. Furthermore, at the end of the 19th century, the Austrians played a pivotal role in creating what was known as a Ukrainian national identity. Why did the Austrians do that? Because they attempted to sow discord in the Russian Empire, because of course the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were fierce, bitter rivals with each other, and of course they were neighbors. So why do I say everything I've just said? Because what Putin said is historically correct. By me saying that, it does not make me a Russian propagandist. Again, I say to people, you don't have to take my word for it. Take yourself to the National Archives in Kew. Speak to the archivists there. Ask them for documents, Foreign Office documents from the 19th century relating to the Russian Empire. And I assure you, you will not see you will not read any mention of a Ukrainian race, and you will not read any mention of a city called Kiev. Only you will read Kiev.
Yeah, I completely believe you, because, of course, the modern world was mapped out and written by the victors of the world wars that have been and other events that came afterwards, of course. This is something where people believe that the knowledge we have today has been the same all throughout time and nothing has changed, and that's not true at all. Now, we are running out of time a little bit. We've got a couple of minutes. I want to ask you two questions. I'm going to ask you for fairly abbreviated answers on these. These are from the chat. The first one's from Luca, who asks, will Putin stop at the Dnieper River, and will Russia take Odessa?
The Russian army will advance to the regions of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, meaning all the regions to the east of those two regions, Odessa, Kirovgrad, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Kiev, Kharkov, etc., will be captured by the Russian army and will be incorporated into the Russian Federation. If the Russian army was to simply stay on the left bank of the river Dnipro, then immediately what is left of Ukraine would become a member of NATO, and Russian national security would be in very, very serious trouble. So under no circumstances will the Russian army remain on the left bank of the river Dnipro. They will cross the river Dnipro as the Soviet army crossed the river Dnipro at the end of 1943.
Yeah, I really, again, I like the cut of your jib. I like what you're talking about, because I think what you're saying is accurate and correct, and that is really rare to be found nowadays. Now, this is possibly the next question up. It's from Dark Commission. It's probably one of the biggest questions. And like I said to you just before, really, you've got to come back on the show, because I had probably about 10 questions that I've not asked you. But this one, I think the Dark Commission has asked, is really important. So again, a fairly short answer, but what will happen if Putin dies, steps down, or is deposed?
Putin will not be deposed. Putin will not step down. Putin could die. Any one of us could die any moment. I could die on live television. I hope not.
Don't do it.
But it's
Please,
possible.
don't do it.
But if Putin is no longer leader, then his successor will simply carry on the Russian military campaign. This is not Putin's war. This is not the endeavors of a, quote, madman. No, this is Russia taking preemptive action against what it perceives to be a very serious threat to its national security. And quite frankly, the Russians are correct when they say that, because NATO is not a peaceful military bloc. I will say this: when NATO bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, it didn't just violate international law. It violated its own founding treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty. It violated Article 1 of the aforementioned treaty, which states clearly and unequivocally that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. So NATO is not a peaceful, innocent military bloc. It is a criminal bloc. It broke its own founding treaty.
You are brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, for coming on the Johnny Vedmore show. Please come on again within the next few weeks. I'd love to continue this conversation. Thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for some of the most accurate and concise answers I think I've received since doing this show. So thank you very much for what you do.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you ever so much for having me on.
Excellent. You're listening to today's News Talk TNT.